you so deep is when I saw you with someone who's not me. I didn't know that I could want you so deep is when I saw you with someone who's not me.
Hey, what's up? How are you? Welcome to yet another tutorial here on my Rode Studio channel. On this occasion, it was the turn to produce a track in the style of the Afterlife label. Many artists have almost the same sound, such as Tale of Us, Minds Against, Colons, among other artists. Let's start with the topic of drums. In the first channel within the group of drums, I have a drum rack. Here I have stored two samples, the kick and the snare. I have a hi-hat that will support the other hi-hat of the TR-808. The next channel I have some claps that I added some effects like delay and reverb with the aim of creating depth to these drums. And finally, I have an emulation of the TR-808 from the UVI brand, which, by the way, I got this VST for free. I advise you to be attentive to the promotions that come to our mail. The melodic house genre often uses the hi-hats and toms of the TR-808. What I'm doing here is taking the independent output of each percussive element of this instrument and sending it to a separate track. I control the hi-hat closed, the hi-hat open, the bass, mid and treble toms on a separate channel. If we look at the arrangement view, you will see that there is no MIDI or audio track, and this is because it is being played from the master track, which is the TR-808. This project is going to be available on my Patreon and Gumroad account, and I know many don't have the UVI TR-808 VST. So what I'm going to do is record these tracks, then just turn the input off by selecting off mode. Now let's listen to all the percussive elements of the drums. Something I like to do with hi-hats is add a vocoder to it, as it gives it a noise texture. Here I added the vocoder effect in parallel on the same channel and the dry channel where it does not contain any audio effects. Remember to set the dry, wet of the audio effect to 100%, and the only thing I will do is modify the release. For example, in this part. In the synth bass in the synthesis, what I did was choose the omnisphere and use three instruments. The instrument A, where I am using a saw-type oscillator. The instrument C, with an oscillator between triangular and sine width in order to give it strength in the part of the low frequencies. And in the instrument D, I am using a noise-type oscillator. Let's just listen to the oscillators of the three instruments. On the instrument A, I am going to activate the harmony tool where I will play two more voices. One pan to the extreme left and the other to the extreme right. The two will be an eighth above. Then I went on to activate the filter of each of the instruments, A, C, and D. We activate the filter in which the three instruments will have the same configuration. It is important to configure the filter envelope. I kept this configuration for the three instruments, A, C, and D. I turn on the arpeggiator where I designed this rhythm pattern, basically lowering the velocity of the second note. Now let's move on to the channel audio effects. Here I start with the equalizer where it has two functions as its objective. The first function is to reduce this frequency that I don't like for the mix of this production, and the second function is to automate the frequency parameter by cutting the high-pass filter that is found in this part. The next effect is a multi-band dynamics where a different compression is done for each frequency range, low, mid and high frequencies. And finally, I have a compressor that is doing the sidechain function where it is linked to the kick. That is, every time the kick sounds, what the compressor is going to do is reduce the volume of my synth bass. I am going to deactivate the effects to concentrate on the synthesis. I am also going to deactivate the arpeggiator, which is one of the very important elements for this sound design. Here I am using two instruments on the same MIDI track. The first is the wavetable where I am going to generate two oscillators. In oscillator 1 sawtooth and in oscillator 2 I selected the wavetable called subharmonics. Then I activate the filter where the frequency is tied to the envelope of my amp. It is important that you set the parameters in this way in the amplifier envelope. Now, if you saw the movement of the frequency, this is because this parameter is automated. If we see a green dot in the frequency parameter, this means that it is linked to a macro. In Ableton, we can add up to 16 macros. You may wonder why you tied the frequency parameter to a macro? In the second instrument, I have the analog instrument where I use noise as an oscillator. If you notice, the frequency has a green dot, in the same way as the previous instrument, I am linking this parameter to a macro. So instead of automating the frequency of each instrument, what I can do is link the two frequencies in the same macro, and thus, in turn, I can automate a parameter instead of both. Now I'm going to press play and they'll listen to the two instruments, the wavetable that contains the two oscillators and the analog that contains the noise. When we send the MIDI signal through our MIDI controller, it first reaches the MIDI effect, which in this case is the arpeggiator. What it will do is a translation, and then the signal reaches the two instruments. In the arpeggiator, I modified some parameters. In this, I changed the sync mode to free mode, where we are going to automate the rate parameter, whose function is to modify the speed of this arpeggiator. And finally, in the style parameter, I am using the chord trigger mode. As I already mentioned, I have automated the rate parameter. Here I have the automation view. Let's move on to the topic of audio effects. I start with an equalizer where I am making a high-pass filter cut to cut the low frequencies. Then with the overdrive I generate harmonic distortion in the mid-frequency area. With the multiband dynamics I make a different compression for each frequency range, and finally I have this audio effect that you can find for free on the Valhalla page. The Valhalla Supermassive is generating two effects at the same time, which are delay and reverb. I add a pad simply to generate ambient texture to the background of this production. I also added 2 higher notes simply as detail. We added a new layer to the pads. This layer is a sample I found on splice.com that I really liked the combination between the pad and this sample. We turned off the audio effects to focus first on the synthesis. In the synthesis of this sound, I used the same technique as the previous instrument where we added 2 instruments, the wavetable and the analog. One thing I noticed is that progressive house or melodic house in the sound design uses too much noise texture. In the wavetable, we will only use an oscillator that is a sawtooth, then we activate the filter where we are going to link the 1 frequency filter with the amplifier envelope. Then I automate the frequency of the wavetable and analog to a macro so that I can automate just 1 parameter instead of automating the frequency of each of the instruments. Now let's look at the audio effects. I start with the saturator effect. The next effect is a delay or echo, which is basically the same thing where I cut a high-pass filter and a low-pass filter in the equalizer of the effect, added reverb. An equalizer where I made a high-pass filter cut since when applying a saturator the low frequencies are enhanced, and finally the utility tool where I have the gain parameter automated. For the synthesis of this synth brass, I used 2 instruments, wavetable and analog. In the wavetable, I am activating the 2 oscillators. In oscillator 1, it is a sawtooth, and in oscillator 2, it is the same sawtooth oscillator, only that I modified the pulse width. I also modified the detune to 15 and in oscillator 1 to -15. For the effects, I start with an equalizer since it has a great weight in the sub-bass frequencies, saturator, multiband dynamics, autofilter. I add an audio effect rack where I store 2 effects in parallel mode, and finally an equalizer. In order not to make this video so long, I am going to show you some instruments that I have in this production. We have reached the end of this video tutorial. I hope you liked the new techniques seen in this tutorial, and without further ado, see you in the next video.